10 German panzers are advancing. You have 4 shells, a broken sight, and you're a farm boy. What do you do? He didn't aim for the tanks. No radio, no backup, no orders. From the distance came a familiar rumble, low and steady like thunder rolling across concrete. A German panzer column, multiple tanks, at least 10, maybe more. What happened over the next 9 minutes would become one of the most shocking moments of the Normandy campaign. And yet almost no one has ever heard of it until now. You'll learn how one phrase from his father changed the course of a battle, why his story remained classified for decades, and how instinct triumphs over logic in the most terrifying moments. July 7, 1944. A back road near the village of La Haye-du-Puy in northern France. It was late afternoon. The air was thick with smoke and mist, and the sky hung low. Private Thomas Hawkins, a 24-year-old farm boy from Pennsylvania, crouched behind a broken hedge. His face was caked in mud, blood trickling from his brow. In front of him stood the battered remains of a 57mm anti-tank gun, its sighting scope shattered, with just 4 armor-piercing shells left. The steel beasts of the Nazi war machine were closing in, barreling down that narrow road much faster than intelligence had ever warned. It was the only supply route into the Allied forward position, and Hawkins knew the brutal truth. The line wouldn't hold. If those tanks broke through, every single man in the nearby infantry battalion would be trapped, completely exposed. They had no anti-tank support, absolutely no time to run, and all he had was a damaged cannon and a desperate prayer. He pressed his cheek against the cold, cracked steel, steadying his breath. He whispered, not to God, not to anyone else, but to himself, "If I get one shot, I'll make it count." What unfolded over the next 9 minutes would become one of the most shocking and overlooked moments of the entire Normandy campaign. And yet, almost no one has ever heard of it, until now. Thomas Hawkins wasn't born to be a soldier. He was forged from a different kind of life. Born on a quiet patch of farmland outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where the horizon stretched wider than any world he could have imagined. His father tirelessly raised dairy cattle, while his mother kept their house and 6 children moving with the precision of a finely tuned clock. Thomas was the youngest, a quiet boy with red hair, as thin and unassuming as the wooden fence posts that lined their fields. Most boys in Lancaster spent their days playing baseball, but Thomas, he preferred the silent solitude of the woods. His father had given him a small .22 caliber rifle when he turned 10, and together they would hunt squirrels and rabbits before the sun even thought about rising. His father's rule was simple yet profound: never waste a shot. If you were going to pull that trigger, you had to truly feel the rhythm of the wind, the subtle weight of the air, and the steady heartbeat in your very fingertips. "You don't shoot with your eyes, Tommy," his father would often say. "You shoot with your gut." Years later, that single, simple sentence would ultimately decide the fate of an entire German panzer column. When the war finally reached across the vast ocean, Thomas didn't rush to enlist. The Hawkins family had listened to President Roosevelt's somber speech on their old Zenith radio the day after Pearl Harbor. His older brothers were already married, working tirelessly on the family farms. Thomas was still mending tractors and milking cows, genuinely believing the war would be over long before they ever called his name. But then, in March of 1943, the letter arrived. A selective service draft notice. He left home with just one duffel bag and a carefully folded photograph of Rex, their loyal family farm dog. The train carried him far away to Fort Benning, Georgia. Basic training was, in a word, hell. The oppressive Georgia heat, the relentless red dust, and the endless shouting of sergeants. But Hawkins, he remained steady. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. Yet somehow, he was undeniably dependable. He could read a battlefield just like he used to read the woods back home. When he hit a target, there was no celebration. He'd simply adjust, then fire again. An instructor quickly noticed his incredible calm under pressure and swiftly moved him into anti-tank training. The Americans called their weapon the 57mm gun, a slim cannon light enough to be towed by a jeep, yet absolutely deadly when positioned correctly. The British referred to it as the 6-pounder, but to Hawkins it was just the mule. This weapon kicked hard, it was loud, and it was precise. He mastered stripping it down, oiling it, and reassembling it even with his eyes closed. By the winter of 1943, he could actually judge distance by sound alone, picking up on how the shell's whistle subtly shifted as it sliced through the wind. Still, Hawkins never once saw himself as any kind of hero. In letters sent home, he joked that he was simply the guy who keeps the mule fed. Every Sunday, his mother would write back, "Be brave, Tommy, but please don't be reckless." He'd carefully fold each letter, tucking them into his breast pocket for luck. Then, in May of 1944, his unit boarded a troop ship, setting sail for England. That ocean crossing stretched for nearly 10 long days. The bunks below deck reeked of oil and salt. On the third night, he listened intently as older soldiers whispered about German tanks, the infamous Panzers that had utterly crushed France in 1940. They claimed the armor was so impossibly thick that small-caliber shells would just bounce right off them like mere pebbles. The very name Panzer carried a heavy weight, a guttural growl, almost human in its sheer menace. Hawkins remained silent, but he couldn't help but imagine what it would truly feel like to confront one of those monstrous machines with only a gun crew and just a handful of shells. By early July, they were pushing deeper into Normandy, following the initial invasion. Officers patrolled the rows of tents, constantly reminding everyone of their critical mission: break Hitler's wall and liberate Europe. Hawkins, for his part, simply checked his weapon, packed his rations, and said nothing. He wasn't thinking about grand liberation or personal glory. Instead, his mind was on whether he'd still be able to hear the familiar sound of Pennsylvania crickets after that very first shot was fired. Just 4 days later, he found himself advancing to the front lines in Normandy, dragging that very same 57mm gun through thick, clinging mud. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from an unwavering sense of duty. He was, as his sergeant had once perfectly put it, an ordinary man about to meet an extraordinary moment. The steel column was approaching. That morning, the village of La Haye-du-Puy was eerily quiet, far too quiet. It lay nestled between rolling hedgerows and narrow farm lanes, just like so many other small towns across Normandy. Hawkins, for his part, simply checked his weapon, packed his rations, and said nothing. He wasn't thinking about grand liberation or personal glory. Instead, his mind was on whether he'd still be able to hear the familiar sound of Pennsylvania crickets after that very first shot was fired. Just 4 days later, he found himself advancing to the front lines in Normandy, dragging that very same 57mm gun through thick, clinging mud. His heart was pounding, not from fear, but from an unwavering sense of duty. He was, as his sergeant had once perfectly put it, an ordinary man about to meet an extraordinary moment. The steel column was approaching. That morning, the village of La Haye-du-Puy was eerily quiet, far too quiet. It lay nestled between rolling hedgerows and narrow farm lanes, just like so many other small towns across Normandy. Stone houses, slate roofs, and the distinct, heavy smell of wet earth hung in the air. By July 7, 1944, the American front line had pushed steadily south from Utah Beach, carving a path through the dense hedgerows. The grand strategy was clear: drive further south, disrupt vital German reinforcements, and seize crucial roads before the enemy could possibly regroup. But what intelligence had critically overlooked was one crucial detail. A formidable German panzer column was already hurtling north, gaining ground fast. Private Thomas Hawkins and his small gun crew had been given a daunting order: hold the eastern approach into town. Their 57mm anti-tank gun was strategically placed near a tree line, offering a narrow view over a dusty gravel road. It was meant to be ideal cover, but it provided no real elevation, and visibility was severely limited. Still, it was all they had. They'd arrived the night before, under the cloak of darkness, spending the early morning hours diligently clearing brush and meticulously preparing potential fallback points. Then, sometime around 3 in the afternoon, the first sign emerged. It began as an almost imperceptible hum, growing quickly into a distinct tremble in the very ground beneath them. That specific kind of vibration that travels straight to your spine before your ears even register the sound. Hawkins froze, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel barrel of his gun. His loader, Private Kenny, glanced up from an ammo box, his eyes wide as he whispered, "You feel that?" The sound intensified dramatically. Not just a single engine, but many. The unmistakable, guttural grinding of heavy treads, the churning of massive gears, the deep, ominous rumble of something incredibly heavy and deliberate. Hawkins cautiously stepped out from behind the concealing brush and raised his field glasses. Through the lingering mist and haze, he saw them, menacing black crosses emblazoned on dark gray hulls. Panther tanks, at least 3 abreast, followed closely by armored half-tracks and a line of supply trucks. He quickly counted at least 10 vehicles, maybe more. This was no mere patrol. This was a full-scale, mechanized counterattack. The narrow gravel road they defended, barely wide enough for one vehicle, led directly into the heart of La Haye-du-Puy. If this column broke through, the village would surely fall. The infantry companies inside would be completely overrun. Hawkins slowly lowered his binoculars. There was no time, absolutely none, to radio for support. No air cover, no artillery, just 4 men, a battle-scarred cannon, and a mere handful of armor-piercing rounds. To compound their desperate situation, their sighting scope had cracked earlier that morning during a shell impact. It was technically still functional, but hopelessly inaccurate. The team had reported it, but replacements were simply unavailable. Hawkins turned to face the others, his expression grim. "We're not going to stop them all," he stated plainly, his voice steady. "But we can slow them down." Private Kenny, sweat already beading on his undershirt, asked, "How many shells we got left?" "4, that's it." The other crew members exchanged silent, knowing looks. No one spoke. Hawkins dropped to one knee, placed a hand on the cannon's breech, and quietly closed his eyes. The rhythm of the approaching machines vibrated through the ground, a relentless drumbeat from another world. The air itself tasted metallic, a mix of rust and rain. Fear wasn't precisely what he felt. No, it was something far colder, far clearer. A stark certainty that no one else was coming, that they were utterly alone, and that every single second mattered. Then the lead panzer rumbled into view. I'm not waiting for orders." Private Thomas Hawkins had never actually fired the 57mm anti-tank gun in a real fight, not until this very moment. He'd rehearsed this hundreds of times on those muddy fields back in Georgia, imagining the distant tree line was an enemy tank column. But the difference now was brutally simple. This time it was real, and there was absolutely no margin for error. That lead panzer advanced, a menacing steel fist punching through the morning fog. It was a Panther tank, the absolute workhorse of the German armored divisions. We're talking about 45 tons of solid steel, armed with a 75mm high-velocity cannon, and wrapped in armor thick enough to just shrug off small arms fire and even light explosives. It was built to terrify, and it was doing its job. Private Kenny was already at the ammunition box, his gloved hands visibly trembling as he carefully lifted the first armor-piercing shell. Hawkins tried to steady the cannon, attempting to line up the shot despite the completely cracked sighting scope. He peered down the barrel, but all he saw was pure distortion. He adjusted left. Still wrong. There was simply no way to get a clean aim. "We're blind," he muttered, the words heavy. "What do we do?" Kenny whispered back, his voice tight. Hawkins didn't answer right away. His eyes darted, scanning every inch of the terrain. Up ahead, the road narrowed significantly at a small stone bridge, maybe 200 yards out. Past that bridge, the road curved sharply around a shallow slope, barely wide enough for a single tank to pass. He noticed the dampness along the far edge of the bridge itself. Erosion, water had clearly been running underneath from recent rains. A sudden, bold idea sparked. He wasn't going to shoot the tank, he was going to shoot the road. "Load it," he commanded, his voice firm. "You sure?" Kenny asked, disbelief in his tone. "Nope," Hawkins replied, "but I'm not waiting for permission." Hawkins dropped quickly into his firing position, bracing his shoulder against the gun. No working sight, no clear markers, just raw memory and pure gut instinct. He flashed back to those hunting trips, how his father had taught him to feel the moment, not overthink it. He carefully lined up the barrel just to the right of the bridge's corner, took a long, steady breath, then exhaled slowly. Firing! The cannon roared, kicking back with immense force, the recoil slamming hard into the dirt. For a split second, there was nothing but the ringing in his ears. Then, impact. The shell struck precisely to the right of the bridge's main support wall, instantly cracking its edge. Chunks of stone violently erupted, and the very dirt beneath the road began to crumble under the sudden, immense stress. It wasn't a complete collapse, no, but it was absolutely enough. The path ahead was now fractured, uneven, and utterly dangerous for anything more than a small jeep. The lead panzer saw the damage, but it was far too late. Its driver slammed on the brakes, but pure momentum carried the massive vehicle forward. The right tread slipped over the loose edge, tilting the tank just enough to knock it completely off balance. The huge machine ground to a halt, tilted awkwardly, blocking the road entirely. Behind it, absolute chaos. The second and third panzers slammed on their brakes. One skidded violently sideways right into the ditch. The third halted just in time, but the entire line was broken. And worse for them, they were bunched up, clustered, totally exposed, and still moving forward without any space to maneuver. Hawkins turned to Kenny. "Give me the second shell," he commanded. This time he wasn't aiming for a tank. He was aiming for the fuel truck at the very rear of the convoy. He fired. The explosion was instant, and it was enormous. Flames shot a staggering 20 feet into the air. That truck just burst like a matchstick soaked in gasoline. The heat was blinding. Shrapnel tore through nearby vehicles. One of the half-tracks caught fire, immediately igniting its own ammunition. Secondary blasts rocked the countryside, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. In less than 60 seconds, that formidable panzer column had transformed into a brutal traffic jam of twisted steel and raging flame. Kenny looked over, his eyes wide with shock. "Holy hell, Tommy," he breathed. Hawkins didn't crack a smile. He was already reaching for the third shell. He said only this, his voice grim: "We're not done." This was the art of chaos. Smoke now blanketed the field like a heavy, suffocating curtain. Flames danced along the crushed, burning remains of the fuel truck. The once unstoppable German panzer column was no longer a neat line. It was a knot, tangled, burning, and utterly confused. Private Thomas Hawkins didn't wait around. He knew better than to celebrate too early. The third shell clanked into place. Kenny slammed the breech shut and instinctively ducked low. "Target?" Kenny asked, his voice tight. "The one trying to turn around?" Hawkins replied, his eyes scanning. One of the Panthers, sleek and heavily armored, had actually backed up into a small clearing, desperately attempting to reverse out of the ambush zone. It was the only tank with enough room to pivot. If it managed to escape, it could easily flank the American line, or even worse, call in reinforcements. Hawkins adjusted the cannon ever so slightly, judging elevation and distance purely by memory. He didn't speak a word. He just pulled the trigger. The 57mm shell whistled through the smoky air and struck the Panther's rear armor with a sickening thud. The impact didn't destroy it outright, but it completely disabled the engine. Thick black smoke billowed from the back. The tank lurched forward a few feet, then died in place. Now the Germans were truly panicking. From the tanks and half-tracks, German voices barked orders, loud and frantic. Some soldiers quickly dismounted, scrambling for cover, while others fired blindly into the tree line, desperately searching for an enemy they couldn't even see. The Americans, just 4 of them, were hunkered down behind a broken cannon, with only half a dozen shells left and their cover quickly fading. But Hawkins had one crucial advantage the Germans didn't. He controlled the very rhythm of this battle. Every time he fired, he forced them to react. Every delay, every deafening explosion, every flicker of doubt in the enemy's eyes, he owned it all. "Shell number 4, Hawkins shouted. Kenny hesitated. "After this one, we've only got one left." "Then let's make this one count." Hawkins swung the cannon toward the center of the road, where 2 tanks, in a fit of panicked confusion, had become hopelessly wedged side by side. One had tried to maneuver around a burning wreck only to clip its partner. Their treads were locked, creating a perfect, unmoving target. The cannon fired again. This time, the shell struck low beneath the turret of the forward Panther. Sparks and flame erupted from underneath. The massive tank rocked violently, then shuddered to a complete stop. It didn't explode, but it was dead, utterly disabled. A 50-ton corpse right in the middle of their kill zone. For the first time since the ambush had erupted, Hawkins heard something entirely new. Silence. No engines revving, no shouted commands, just the crackle of fire, the pop of cooking ammunition, and the slow metallic groan of cooling armor. The panzer column was paralyzed, pinned between a collapsed bridge, burning wrecks, and blocked escape routes. The once feared tide of German armor had become a stationary graveyard. But Hawkins wasn't breathing easy just yet. He slowly stood, scanning the horizon. Something felt wrong, too easy, too quiet. Then he saw it. A lone panther, still mobile, was inching forward through the trees on the far left flank. It moved slowly, quietly, using the cover like a seasoned hunter. It had seen the muzzle flash of Hawkins' gun, and it was coming for him. One shell left. The surviving panther moved like a true predator, slow, quiet, deliberate. Its turret stayed low, rotating as it crept along the tree line, diligently searching for the source of the ambush. Hawkins immediately saw the angle it was taking, not down the main road, but up along the eastern slope, attempting to flank his position from higher ground. "Tommy, it's coming," Kenny whispered, his voice tense. "I see it," Hawkins replied, his voice calm despite the cold pressure building behind his ribs. They had poured their last 3 shells into creating a wall of fire and steel, but now it had all come down to this. Just 1 shell, 1 single round left in that crate. No backup, absolutely no room for error, and nowhere to relocate. The Panther would have a clear shot in less than a minute, and its main gun, a 75mm high-velocity cannon, could rip through trees, bunkers, or even bone without so much as slowing down. Hawkins crouched next to the ammo box, picked up that final shell, and paused. It felt heavier than all the others, not physically, but mentally. The sheer weight of everything they had left, all their hope, was packed into that one casing. He looked at Kenny, who was frozen solid, hands visibly trembling. "You with me?" Hawkins asked, his voice low. Kenny managed a nod, but his lips were tight. "Then load it." The round slid into the chamber with a metallic thud. The breech clanged shut. The gun was ready. And so was the enemy. The Panther had moved into its final position. Its massive barrel now pointed directly at the hedgerow, where the Americans were dug in. The crew inside that tank had no idea how many attackers were really hiding there. For all they knew, it could be a full squad. But they were about to find out fast. A branch snapped. Then came the sound Hawkins dreaded most, the distant electric whir of the Panther's turret locking on. He didn't have a clean shot. The dense tree cover, the lingering smoke, the uneven ground, all of it made aiming almost impossible. But then a memory surfaced, hunting squirrels with his dad. Those times when the rifle sights were useless because the target was either too close or too quick. His father's voice echoed back, clear as a whisper carried on gunpowder. "You don't aim with your eyes, Tommy, you aim with your gut." He let that memory settle deep, then dropped to one knee, adjusting the cannon purely by feel. No sight, no markers, just raw instinct. He exhaled slowly, feeling the cold dirt beneath his boots, the low rumble in the air, that profound stillness right before lightning strikes. Then he fired. The shot erupted from the barrel with a crack, like the sky itself splitting open for a half-second. Silence, then a deafening impact. The shell slammed into the Panther's left tread, tore through the outer skirt armor, and ruptured the engine block. The tank screamed, a mechanical, tortured sound, before its turret collapsed sideways and the massive vehicle stopped cold. No explosion this time, just death by brutal precision. Kenny dropped to his knees, laughing hysterically from sheer shock. "You got it, Tommy! You got it!" But Hawkins didn't move. His hands remained gripping the cannon. His eyes were locked, unblinking on the smoking shell of what had almost killed them. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe it was truly over, that they might actually live to see the next hour, that 4 shells and a broken scope had somehow turned the tide. And yet, deep down, he knew better. You see, in war, true peace, it never arrives cleanly. The sacrifice is always there. The battlefield finally fell silent. No more cannons roaring. No more tank treads grinding over gravel. Just the distant, unsettling crackle of burning fuel and the low, guttural moans of wounded men, both German and American. Thick smoke drifted across that narrow road like a sinister fog rolling over a river, coiling its way through the barren trees. Private Thomas Hawkins slowly pushed himself up, his legs trembling beneath him. The back of his neck was drenched in sweat, his uniform caked with grime. His right hand throbbed, raw and blistered from the cannon's intense heat, and his ears were still ringing, a persistent echo of that last deafening shot. Nearby, Kenny crouched, gasping for air, searching for the right words. "Tommy, you did it," he finally managed, his voice breaking. "You really did it. You stopped them." Hawkins didn't reply. His gaze remained locked on the burning wrecks sprawled ahead. Their cannon, his cannon, stood empty now, a silent shell of steel. But it had done its job. The moment stretched, heavy and profound. Then, without warning, a shrill, metallic whistle pierced the quiet, that unmistakable shriek of incoming mortar fire. Before either man could even flinch, a German mortar round slammed into the ground, just 10 yards from their spot. The blast ripped through the air like a clap of thunder. Dirt exploded upwards, and shrapnel tore through the air. Hawkins was thrown violently backward, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud, arms splayed out beside the cannon. Blood immediately began to soak through his left side. A jagged piece of metal had ripped straight through his ribs. Kenny scrambled over to him, gripping his shoulders. "Tommy, Tommy, stay with me!" Hawkins blinked slowly. His eyes, though glassy, still held consciousness. He looked up at the sky, a vast gray emptiness, and tried to speak. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. Only a faint gurgle escaped his throat. Kenny pressed down on the terrible wound, tears streaming down his face. "Don't you leave, man! You can't leave now! We're going to get help! But Hawkins, with a trembling effort, lifted one hand and briefly touched Kenny's arm. Then, ever so slightly, he turned his head towards the cannon, which was still smoking, still pointed forward. His mouth moved once more, this time a whisper, almost lost beneath the ringing in the air. "Tell him we held." His eyes didn't close. They simply stopped moving. Still open, still focused, still guarding. Kenny stayed there, cradling his friend, until the medics finally arrived some 20 minutes later. They found the cannon unmanned, its steel blood-stained, still aimed precisely at the spot where the last Panther tank had met its end. And there beside it lay Private Thomas Hawkins, silent, completely still, one hand resting on the breech lever, as if, even in death, he refused to let go. He never broke, never hesitated, never retreated. And he would never see the world he'd just saved from behind the smoke and fire. By the time reinforcements finally arrived, the sun was already starting to dip below the low Norman hills. The air hung heavy with soot. The ground, no longer shaking from tanks, now trembled instead with the quiet, cautious tread of boots picking their way through the smoldering wreckage. A scout jeep from the 79th Infantry Division finally rolled to a stop at the edge of the ambush. Lieutenant Randall Woods stepped out, his gaze sweeping the scene with utter disbelief. A dozen vehicles lay destroyed or abandoned. 4 of them were tanks, Panthers, now just blackened, twisted, silent hulks. A fuel truck was nothing but a charred skeleton. Ammunition still cooked off sporadically, popping in the distance like distant firecrackers. Bodies, both German and American, lay strewn across the ravaged field in an eerie, unsettling silence. Woods turned to his radio operator. "This wasn't air support," he stated. "No, sir," the operator confirmed. "No airstrike was ever called in." So what was this? Medics soon found Private Kenny sitting next to a body draped in a blood-soaked tarp. Hawkins. His hand was still curled near the cannon. Kenny wouldn't let him go. He wouldn't speak at first, just stared straight ahead, lips pressed tight, jaw clenched, as if holding on to something so immense he could never, ever voice it. Finally, a chaplain knelt beside him and gently asked, "Did he die fast?" Kenny's voice was barely a whisper. "He died standing his ground." Lieutenant Woods ordered a full inspection. His officers meticulously measured shell impacts, crater angles, and damage trajectories. They found only one American anti-tank position, a 57-millimeter gun with a shattered scope, covered in dust and blood, its barrel still smoking. It defied all logic. They crunched the numbers, calculated the impossible odds. 4 shells fired, 4 confirmed hits, all within mere minutes, all with perfect timing, and all, somehow, without a functioning sight. The official after-action report would later read, "It is the assessment of this command that Private Thomas Hawkins, acting without orders and utilizing an impaired weapon system, successfully delayed and disabled an enemy armored column estimated at 10 to 12 vehicles, thereby preserving the town of La Haye-du-Puy and preventing major American casualties." And so the word began to spread. First just among the artillery crews, then quickly among the tank units, and eventually all the way up through division headquarters. The whispers always followed the same pattern. "Did you hear about the red-haired farm boy with the busted cannon? The one who stopped an entire column with one shot and aimed without a scope?" He'd said he aimed with his gut. At first, no one truly believed it, not entirely, yet no one could offer any other explanation either. In the days immediately following that brutal battle, the field near La Haye-du-Puy transformed into something sacred, a hallowed ground. Soldiers from every nearby unit made their pilgrimage, passing through, compelled to pause and simply stare at the wreckage. Some stood in stunned silence, others in absolute disbelief. What had initially appeared to be an impenetrable American strongpoint was, in chilling reality, just one single cannon and a dead man who had utterly refused to yield. Word of this extraordinary stand spread like wildfire, far faster than anyone could have predicted. A sergeant from the 101st Airborne famously dubbed it a one-man Alamo. A British tank crew, rolling through the devastation, called it madness, but quickly added blessed madness. And one Canadian infantryman, kneeling reverently beside the broken gun, gently laid a ration biscuit on its cold breech, whispering softly, "For the bloke who didn't blink." But the wheels of bureaucracy, as always, turned slowly. It took a painstaking 2 weeks for the initial commendation reports to even reach the rear echelon. Then it took 3 more weeks just to compile all the eyewitness accounts, conduct thorough battlefield assessments, and verify the ordnance used. Eventually, a Silver Star was approved. And then, incredibly, a Distinguished Service Cross, one of the absolute highest awards the U.S. Army could bestow for valor shown under fire. By the time these honors were formalized, Thomas Hawkins had already been laid to rest. His final resting place was the solemn Normandy American Cemetery, just outside Colleville-sur-Mer. You'll find him in Plot D, Row 23, grave number 18, marked by a simple white cross. The inscription reads, PVT Thomas J. Hawkins, Pennsylvania, July 7, 1944. He was just 24 years old. His mother, back home, received the devastating telegram first, delivered by hand to her quiet Pennsylvania door. Then, in time, came the gleaming medals. And finally, the letter, the one found in his chest pocket, miraculously blood-stained yet still intact. It was dated July 6th, the very day before that fateful ambush. In it he had written, Dear Ma, by the time you read this, I'm deep in France. They say we'll be pushing forward soon. Everyone's scared, but won't admit it. Me too. I guess I just want to do my part and come home. If I don't, I hope you won't cry too hard. I'm not writing this because I think I'll die. I'm writing it because I've seen good men do brave things. And I figure if the time comes, I want you to know I tried. If I don't come back, tell Dad I remembered the squirrels. He'll understand. Love you always, Tommy. His mother cherished that letter, keeping it tucked safely within her Bible for the remainder of her life. Years later, when a new war memorial was finally built in Lancaster County, she stood at its unveiling with an incredible, quiet grace. She didn't shed a single tear. Instead, she simply looked at the cold stone, gently touched her gloved hand to her son's etched name, and softly said, He was never reckless. He just didn't wait for permission to do what was right. Decades continued to pass. The Great War eventually ended. Towns were rebuilt. Nations moved forward. But the story of Thomas Hawkins, that never faded. It became legend in boot camp stories, passed down from instructors to new recruits. It was cited in field manuals, not by name, but as a powerful case study in improvised aim under extreme combat pressure. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, future artillerymen were once shown a diagram of a Normandy ambush, simply labeled the Hawkins position. He was never famous, never featured in a movie, and no statue bears his likeness. Yet, among the men who truly understood what it meant to stare down a panzer with nothing but sheer guts and steel, his name carried immense weight. And in Normandy, the local people remembered him. The very road where that battle occurred was later quietly renamed Chemin du Canon Solitaire, the Road of the Lone Gun. There was no grand ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a simple wooden sign nailed to a post where poppies bloom each July. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, a small group of French schoolchildren come and place flowers at that old hedge. Most don't know the full story, but their teachers tell them, one man stood here, and because he stood, we are free. There's a natural temptation when we hear stories like this to label them as myth, to simply assume that no real person could possibly stand alone against tanks, against fire, against terror, and actually win. But here's the truth. Wars aren't won only by generals, or massive air raids, or perfectly drawn maps. They are so often decided in places no one planned for, by people no one ever expected. People just like Private Thomas Hawkins. He wasn't larger than life. He didn't have perfect aim. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He simply understood something that far too many forget. That in the face of overwhelming force, the one thing no enemy can ever predict is pure courage. His scope was broken, his team was scattered, his weapon was outdated, but his will? That remained absolutely intact, unshakable. It didn't come from rank or reputation. It came from the memory of his father's voice, of Pennsylvania fields, of a little hunting rifle, and a rule as old as war itself: never waste your shot. Hawkins aimed not just with his eyes, but with his very life. He didn't simply stop a column of tanks. He stopped fear itself from advancing 1 inch further. And in doing so, he reminded us that the battlefield isn't always a physical place. Sometimes it's a single moment, one breath, one choice, one shot. He made his, and it counted.